Thank you so much, Harry. It's such a pleasure to be here at this terrific conference and with such a fabulous lineup of speakers. I'm Laura Bliss. I'm a reporter at CityLab, part of Bloomberg News, where I cover transportation, technology, and mapping in cities. And I'm really pleased to be here with Daniel Ramot, who is the co-founder and CEO of VIA, and also has quite a fascinating background with a doctorate in neuroscience from Stanford. Previously worked on supercomputers designed to discover new pharmaceutical drugs before founding VIA. So that's a story for another occasion, I'm afraid. But today I'm really delighted to get to speak with you, Daniel, about where VIA stands in the tumultuous transportation landscape of the last 3.5+ months. So let's start with that. I mean, every organization, every company, every industry has had to change and adapt in some ways quite dramatically, in some ways less so, amid the coronavirus pandemic. Let's start with that. I mean, what has the last 3.5, 4 months looked like for VIA?
Thanks, Laura. It's really nice to be here and great to be part of this conference. I think that's obviously a key question for everyone in the last few months, particularly in the transportation space. There's been, as I'm sure you know, and I'm sure everybody's talking about in this conference, just a huge impact on transportation across the board. I would say for VIA, what we've seen is we have a part of our business that's more in the sort of ride-sharing, ride-hailing category, ride-hailing rides for shared rides, multiple passengers pooled in the same vehicles that we run in a number of larger cities in the US and Europe. That's obviously been impacted quite significantly as other ride-hailing companies have reported. The core part of our business where we're leveraging that technology, providing it to cities and transit authorities in a partnership to help municipalities, help transport operators run their systems more dynamically in a more data-driven way. That part we've seen a lot less impact on. I think there's still a huge need to provide transportation. What we have seen is that we've needed to evolve and become more flexible and adapt those services very quickly to support the needs of the cities and our partners to move health workers and other essential workers, in some cases to move sort of critical supplies, meals, formula, diaper for people who can't get out of their houses anymore. So there's been a real need to be very, very adaptive and move very quickly and respond to the needs. And one thing I'll say is that I think cities that have a system like VIA in place have found it much easier to respond to the COVID crisis because that system is so dynamic and can respond so quickly versus cities that only rely on fixed route transit where it's much harder to adapt, I believe.
Maybe you can give a couple of examples, and I'd love to know like how much. I mean, I know that VIA runs in markets all over the United States and with kind of in a range of partnership models, right? In some cases, VIA is just providing technology. In some cases, it's providing actual vehicles, and there's kind of different layers to the model. So maybe give us a few examples of particular cities where things have changed, and I'd love to know too, like how much, I don't know, as a percentage maybe, like how many of the regular commuters, have you continued to see using VIA to just go to work or whatever they were doing before versus kind of reallocating to some of those emergency needs?
Yeah, happy to. So a few examples. One example is our service in Berlin, where we work together with the BVG, the Public Transit Authority of Berlin, where very quickly, as it became apparent that COVID was having a tremendous impact in Germany, and Germany was shutting down, most of the country, we adapted the service that was targeted at commuters and at people who were going out late at night in the center of the city. And we expanded that zone to cover much of the city and serve only health workers. So you had to sort of apply. There's an eligibility criterion, and that service was free for those health workers. And we ran that service for a couple months. And then recently, when the city reopened, we've sort of, in the last couple of weeks, come back to the original service. So that's one example where very quickly it was possible to take that service, which has about 150 vans that run around the eastern half of central Berlin under normal circumstances, and then use it to allow nurses and other hospital staff to get to and from their workplace, particularly late at night when the public transit system wasn't able to serve them. It wasn't running at full capacity, and there was a lot greater need for that. I'd say another example is in Los Angeles, where we again worked with LA Metro to quite quickly expand the zone of the service that we have there, which is a partnership with the city, which was mostly focused on commuters on first last mile to 3 major transit hubs. And we took that service and expanded it and allowed folks to particularly use that to transport supplies. So we were transporting food, formula, diapers, and so forth to families in need who were previously either getting those supplies, just by their kids going to school and getting their meals there, or were now unable to leave their homes to purchase those supplies. And so that was a critical help. Another service in the Gulf, we launched a service in Abu Dhabi that was completely new, primarily targeted at health workers and other essential workers. And I have dozens of examples like this around the world. But it's pretty interesting to see how cities, I think, and transit authorities have been much more nimble during this period than one might normally give them credit for, which has been, from our perspective, great to see.
And I mean, in terms of the sort of pre-pandemic, like normal commuter via rider, I mean, has Via seen the same just like massive drop off that pretty much every other mode has seen?
Yeah. So I would say it really depends. So in our service, such as in New York, where we're basically running a service that's free to any consumer, a consumer-facing service where you can book a ride on your phone through the Via app, that is absolutely seeing the same levels of 85, 90% decline. So that's certainly been the case. In other places, one graph I recently saw was from our service in Dubai, where there was a dip. It was not quite as large as it was. And this service is part of the public transportation system. It's supported by the government there, so it's low cost. It's really meant to complement the existing bus system. And there was a dip. It was much smaller. And then since then, that service has recovered and actually rebounded to levels that are higher than the pre-COVID levels, versus when you look at almost every other mode in that area, that city, including ride-hailing and public transportation, is at much lower levels than before. And I think there is a really nice balance there of low cost, high convenience, and then relative safety, where you're not sharing, like on a bus with an unknown number of passengers, maybe very crowded. That we've limited the capacity of each vehicle, so you're only sharing perhaps with 1 or 2 other people in relatively spacious vans, and so you're able to maintain some social distancing. And it seems that at least in some localities, folks are preferring that mode to other modes.
That's really interesting, right? I mean, we've seen obviously a number of economies reopen in the last 4 to 6 weeks. And so I'm sure you're sort of getting more of a sense as you're describing of what the kind of long-term changed needs of cities might be. I mean, can you talk a little bit more about that, about what you're hearing from your transit agency partners? I mean, what they're kind of increasingly interested in microtransit, in sort of getting out of microtransit?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd say is that over the last, probably, we started the microtransit business probably about 8 years ago, and I think, we like to think of ourselves as being the first to do that. And in the beginning, no agency or city was interested in anything that, microtransit, I think, is a term, didn't really exist. No one was interested in it. About maybe a year or 2 ago, it started to become more something that agencies started to look at more seriously and consider. And in the last, probably 6, it's become pretty mainstream. There are a lot of agencies that seem in cities that are very interested in deploying microtransit. And then what we've seen over the last few months is, and I have a pretty strong view there, is that transit agencies are facing a real crisis. The current network as it's currently structured, just a fixed route, the way they've been running it for years, they don't have the budget often to support it. Ridership is down. There are a lot of real challenges, I think, for agencies to get riders back, to trust the system and return to their previous levels. And the ridership is also very unpredictable. I think it's quite different. You're seeing quite different patterns from what you might have seen pre-COVID. And even during the COVID crisis, every week can be different from the previous week, as we're seeing around the country, as states or cities are opening and then potentially closing again. So there's a real challenge for agencies, I think, to manage that with their typical approach of running buses and trains and subways in some places. And this is where there's now a lot greater openness, I believe, to technology and to solutions. It's not the only solution, and microtransit is not a magic bullet to fix everything, but there's a lot more openness to microtransit and to rethinking how the network should be structured, and where more flexible, more dynamic, more demand responsive solutions can allow, frankly, first and foremost, cost savings during this very tough period, but also maintaining a certain level of service for the local residents as we're working through this crisis. So we've seen an acceleration in interest in microtransit over the last few months, which is pretty interesting from our perspective, and we really welcome it. And I do think that agencies that don't turn to new solutions and to technology might really struggle over the next few months and years.
Right. I mean, I think one of the long-standing critiques of the microtransit model, as it was at least being discussed, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, is that it's kind of being rolled out as this kind of magic bullet solution, as you said. And clearly, if you're running like even a 10-seat, 12-seat van at full capacity and trying to do it in a sort of demand responsive way, I mean, you're just never going to be able to achieve the same capacity and kind of efficiencies as a fixed route transit system is. And I mean, now this is a really different moment where the capacity question is, I mean, not only partly a safety issue, but also just a sort of numerical problem, right? I mean, we're just seeing such declined capacity, not for every city, but for many. So I don't know, I'm curious about your thoughts and kind of response to how transit has evolved and kind of the public or perception in the industry, perhaps.
Yeah, I think, just like with politics, I think it's very easy to sort of make strong statements one way or the other that I think, when you do that, it's hard to kind of reach the right solution. I think the same applies to microtransit. I think if one tries to claim, oh, microtransit is where all public transit should go, that's certainly not going to be the case. As you were saying, if you look down, running a bus in New York, say down Fifth Avenue, it doesn't make sense to replace that with a demand responsive van. We could put aside what you should be doing during COVID or not. But there are many other cases where running a 30-passenger bus through a very sparsely populated suburb is going to be incredibly inefficient. No matter how big that bus is, you're never going to fill it. And running a smaller van with fewer seats that's demand responsive, that can run effectively much more frequently and therefore serve a lot more people and cover with one van, what would amount to multiple bus routes just with a single vehicle that's dynamic, that's obviously going to be much more efficient. So I think the point here is that there's nuance, and there are scenarios where microtransit can be incredibly efficient. And yes, when you look at it, you'll say, oh, but you can't get as many people into a dynamic van as you can into a fixed route bus. Okay, but that's not apples to apples. That's true for a fixed route bus running through downtown 100%, but that's not true for a fixed route bus running through a very sparsely populated suburb. In that scenario, you're going to get a lot more people into a dynamic van than you would into a bus. So it's just a matter of figuring out where to deploy which solution and giving public transit agencies, which is a sort of a change management process, if you will. People have to change their thinking, but giving them the tools to solve the problem in the best possible ways. And again, just like not everybody in a city is going to use an electric scooter or bike, just the reality of it. The microtransit solution is not going to solve all of your problems. And as it's turned out, neither is the fixed route bus. That's why so many people drive. But if agencies have got all of these tools together in their toolkit, then I believe they can find the right balance in order to provide the best possible public transit service to their residents. So one thing we're doing is trying to work with agencies to do these analyses. And we have a service that we provide to help them analyze their network and say, where should I keep running my fixed route buses? Many places that's the right answer. They're going to be the most efficient. And where can I complement them with dynamic, data-driven on-demand vans where that could make sense, where I could get a good solution. Again, it's not going to be higher utilization than your bus in a dense urban downtown environment, but it's better than you might be able to do it probably with any other solution. And it's better than everybody driving their own private cars, at least I believe. So I think that's to me the right way to think about it, is just a more nuanced way.
Mm. Yeah, I think a related question is a fear that I have in covering the transportation landscape, is this kind of deepening like transportation apartheid, so to speak, where you see public transit systems really being kind of a mode of last resort for lower income people and people of color who have to commute to their jobs, and who are riding systems that now have even less funding before and might be even more poorly maintained than before and may present health risks of any number of varieties, whereas, you know, whiter and more affluent folks like ourselves, right, like get to work from our houses and don't have to worry about this or can opt for other modes. So, I mean, I'm curious about who you've seen, you know, using VIA throughout the pandemic. And relatedly, I mean, VIA is kind of this in-between model, as you just said yourself. I mean, where does VIA kind of plug into the economic and racial inequalities that exist in our transportation systems?
So, Laura, this is a very timely, you know, topic, obviously, and I could not agree with you more. I think there is historically systemic bias and racism in the way many of our transit systems are designed. I think you're absolutely right, and I think that, you know, what's happening is as we create new solutions such as ride hailing and so forth, it's so much easier for more affluent folks to leave the transit system behind, if you will. And I do think that the way that, you know, that we've always thought about VIA is an equalizer between kind of all of the technology that exists, whether it's in, if you go out and buy a Mercedes E-Class, just to give an example, or a Toyota Camry, it doesn't really matter. It is packed with so much technology, and there's so much innovation that goes into every model. And when you look at the way we've run our transit system, there's not a lot of innovation that has gone into it. You know, the bus still looks like it did 20, 30, 50 years ago. And so, you know, I think everyone at VIA truly believes that if we're going to try to kind of even the playing field, we've got to be able to use technology. And microtransit is not the only solution. Obviously, that's one that we favor, but there are many other ways that I think technology can support public transportation, whether it's data and planning and, you know, making it more accessible and many different things that we can talk about, including, I think, micromobility that kind of opens up other potential mobility options for folks of lower income. And so I think that's a very important topic. And one thing that we see is that a lot of times where the VIA service is deployed, it expands mobility for folks who previously didn't have access to it. So whether it's our, you know, be happy to talk more about it, but our service in Birmingham, Alabama, which is a very interesting transit system where I think we've provided a solution for folks who previously didn't have access to particularly good mobility, and many other places around the country. Many times our services are targeted at seniors, at folks who have certain disabilities, like paratransit services. So I do think this is, you know, when you think about kind of the access to technology and transportation that you and I have, whether it's, you know, a VIA in New York or an Uber or a Lyft or whatever it may be, versus some folks who are of lesser means, I think if we can introduce that type of technology into the transit system, we can really even things out a little bit more.
We are past time, but my last question for you is whether you miss your pre-pandemic commute, and why or why not?
Well, that's a great question. I actually have to say I very much do. So I would take VIA obviously to the office every morning in New York City, and I do miss it. I miss meeting folks on my ride. I miss chatting with the driver, and I have to say I miss being in the office and seeing my colleagues every day. I don't know, how do you feel?
I feel the same way. I biked to work, but I miss that a lot, and seeing people in general.
It's tough.
Thank you so much for your time. This was a really great conversation, and thanks so much for our hosts as well.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Laura. Thank you very much.